All right, so we have been talking about the passage in Acts chapter 2 where Peter quotes from the book of Joel. And so I was making the point that most people interpret that as though Peter's quoting from the book of Joel to explain what was going on there in Acts 2 with their speaking in tongues and being filled with the Spirit and those things that take place. So I made the point that in the passage Peter quotes from the book of Joel, and in fact, in the entire book of Joel, Joel never talks about those things. So that's one reason I don't believe that's what is going on with his quotation from the book of Joel, because it really doesn't explain any of those things. And so last time I was making the point that if Peter was intending to explain what was going on with them speaking in tongues, there are much better passages in the Old Testament to explain that. And so last time we looked at Genesis 11, the Tower of Babel, the first time that there were other languages. And I just made the point that the first time there was more than one language, it was a result of God's judgment upon the rebellion at the Tower of Babel. So there's a negative aspect to it related to God's judgment. And so I want to look at, which is, we will see, I think, is instructive in understanding what's going on in Acts chapter 2. But there are, I think, even better Old Testament passages that Peter could have used if that was what he was trying to talk about. And so I'd like to go to Deuteronomy 28 today and look at that passage. And so Deuteronomy chapter 28, and I will first read verse 15. But it shall come to pass, if thou wilt not hearken unto the voice of the Lord thy God, to observe to do all his commandments and his statutes, which I command thee this day, that all these curses shall come upon thee and overtake thee. So God is warning Israel here about curses that will come upon them if they don't obey his commandments and statutes. And then Jean Gross, would you read verse 25 in Deuteronomy 28?
Okay, Deuteronomy 28, 25?
Yep.
25. The Lord shall cause thee to be smitten before thine enemies. Thou shalt go out one way against them, and flee 7 ways before them, and shalt be removed into all the kingdoms of the earth.
So after the warning in verse 15 about curses that will come if they don't obey, then he delineates several curses. And so in verse 25 is one example. The Lord shall cause thee to be smitten before thine enemies, and shalt be removed into all the kingdoms of the earth. Okay, and then again in Deuteronomy 28, Vicky, would you read verse 32?
Thy sons and thy daughters shall be given unto another people, and thine eyes shall look and fail with longing for them all the day long, and there shall be no might in thine hand.
Okay, and so, and as we read I'm picking out certain verses here that the verse 25 talks about thine enemies and being removed into all the kingdoms of the earth. And now in verse 32, thy sons and thy daughters shall be given unto another people. And so I'm emphasizing this, thine enemies, other people, and so forth. Okay, then again in Deuteronomy 28, Dick, would you read verse 33?
Okay, Deuteronomy 28:33. The first fruit of thy land and all thy labors shall a nation which thou knowest not eat up, and thou shalt be only oppressed and crushed always.
So God warns about a foreign invasion of the promised land that will mean that the fruit of thy land and all thy labors shall a nation which thou knowest not, and so take note of that, a nation which thou knowest not, eat up, and thou shalt be only oppressed and crushed away. And then again in Deuteronomy 28, would Dan or Laura read verse 36?
28:36. The Lord shall bring thee and thy king, which thou shalt set over thee, unto a nation which neither thou nor thy fathers have known, and there shalt thou serve other gods, and wood and stone.
Okay, and so again, notice in verse 36, unto a nation which neither thou nor thy fathers have known. And then once again in Deuteronomy 28, would Bonsinger Joyce read verse 37?
And thou shalt become an astonishment, a proverb, and a byword among all nations, whither the Lord shall lead thee.
All right, and so a warning in verse 37 about among all nations, whither the Lord shall lead thee. And then once again in Deuteronomy 28, would Dan or Lisa read verse 41?
All right. Thou shalt beget sons and daughters, thou shalt not enjoy them, for they shall not go into captivity.
All right, so a warning in verse 41, for they shall go into captivity. So again, I'm picking out verses here that all of them have to do with other nations, warnings about other nations. And then Deuteronomy chapter 28, and Gabrielle, would you read verse 1?
I'm sorry, Deuteronomy 28, which one?
Verse 1,
28, 1.
we're going backwards.
Yeah, I was like, did I hear that right? Okay. And it
Yeah.
shall come to pass, if thou shalt hearken diligently unto the voice of the Lord thy God, to observe and to do all his commandments, which I command thee this day, that the Lord thy God will set thee on high above all nations of the earth.
So the chapter begins by God promising if they do obey him, then he will set Israel on high above all nations of the earth. But then if they don't obey him, we've seen this list of curses that involve Israel being taken captive and oppressed in other nations. Okay, and then again in Deuteronomy 28, would Tim or Jean read verses 43 and 44?
Deuteronomy 28, now is that 43 and 44? Okay. The sojourner who is within thee shall get up above thee very high, and thou shalt come down very low. He shall lend to thee, and thou shalt not lend to him. He shall be the head, and thou shalt be the tail.
Okay, and so again, notice the stranger that is within thee shall get up above thee very high. So it's the opposite of what Gabrielle just read in verse 1 about how if Israel obeys, they will be set up high above all the other nations. But if they don't obey him, now in verses 43 and 44, the stranger shall get up above thee very high, and thou shalt come down very low. And then again in Deuteronomy 28, Dominic, would you read verse 48?
Verse 48. Therefore shalt thou serve thine enemies, which the Lord shall send against thee in hunger and in thirst, and in nakedness and in want of all things, and he shall put a yoke of iron upon thy neck until he have destroyed thee.
All right, and so again in verse 48, therefore thou shalt serve thine enemies, which the Lord shall send against thee in hunger and in thirst and nakedness and in want of all things, and he shall put a yoke of iron upon thy neck until he have destroyed thee. So all these warnings about other nations, enemy nations. And then again in Deuteronomy 28, Akun, would you read verse 49?
The Lord shall bring a nation against thee from afar, from the end of the earth, as swift as the eagle flies, a nation whose tongue thou shalt not understand.
Okay, and so this is what I was trying to get to. So in verse 49, in the midst of all these warnings of curses involving a foreign nation, now in verse 49, the Lord shall bring a nation against thee from far, from the end of the earth, as swift as the eagle flieth. And then notice, a nation whose tongue thou shalt not understand. And so in the midst of all these curses, one of the curses is that there will be a nation whose tongue thou shalt not understand. And then again in Deuteronomy 28, Pakinatan, would you read verse 50?
A nation of fierce countenance, which shall not regard the person of the old, nor show favor to the young.
Okay, so one of the judgments that will come upon Israel is that they will hear a foreign tongue that they don't understand. And in verse 50, it will be a nation of fierce countenance. And then again in Deuteronomy 28, so Pakinathan just read verse 50. I'll continue in verse 51. And he shall eat the fruit of thy cattle and the fruit of thy land until thou be destroyed, which also shall not leave thee either corn, wine, or oil, or the increase of thy kine or flocks of thy sheep, until he have destroyed thee. And he shall besiege thee in all thy gates until thy high and fenced walls come down, wherein thou trustedst, throughout all thy land. And he shall besiege thee in all thy gates throughout all thy land, which the Lord thy God giveth thee. And thou shalt eat the fruit of thine own body, the flesh of thy sons and of thy daughters, which the Lord thy God hath given thee, in the siege and in the straitness wherewith thine enemies shall distress thee. So that the man that is tender among you and very delicate, his eyes shall be evil toward his brother, and toward the wife of his bosom, and toward the remnant of his children which he shall leave, so that he will not give to any of them of the flesh of his children, whom he shall eat, because he hath nothing left him in the siege, and in the straitness wherewith thine enemies shall distress thee in all thy gates. The tender and delicate woman among you, which would not adventure to set the sole of her foot upon the ground for delicateness and tenderness, her eyes shall be evil toward the husband of her bosom, and toward her son, and toward her daughter, and toward her young one that cometh out from between her feet, and toward her children which she shall bear, for she shall eat them for want of all things, secretly in the siege and straitness, wherewith thine enemy shall distress thee in thy gates. So you see, this is pretty horrific things going on here. And so this fierce enemy is going to destroy the land and all the sources of food for those in the land, such that they will resort to cannibalism. And then again in Deuteronomy 28, Gene Gross, would you read verse 64?
28:64. And the Lord shall scatter thee among all people from the one end of the earth even unto the other, and there thou shalt serve other gods, which neither thou nor thy fathers have known, even wood and stone.
Okay, and so the Israelites will be scattered among all people. And then again in Deuteronomy 28, Vicky, would you read verse 65?
And among these nations shalt thou find no ease, neither shall the sole of thy foot have rest. But the Lord shall give thee there a trembling heart and failing of eyes and sorrow of mind.
Okay, so again in verse 65, and among these nations shalt thou find no ease. So there's continual warnings in this chapter about a foreign nation and foreign nations. And again, very horrific things taking place in the land. And so, again, we see in the midst of all these horrible judgments, one of the things that they're warned about is that Israel will hear people speaking another tongue, a tongue that they don't understand in their own land. And so, again, we saw in Genesis 11, the Tower of Babel, that other languages began as a judgment on man's rebellion at the Tower of Babel. And now here in Deuteronomy 28, in all these warnings about what will happen if they disobey God involving foreign nations, again, in the midst of this, is that they will hear other languages, other tongues in their land. So that's a sign of when that happens, when they hear other tongues in their own land, that's a sign of God's judgment upon their rebellion. And so repeatedly in the Old Testament, we see that foreign tongues are a sign of judgment upon Israel. Then turn to Isaiah 33. So I'll mention, we'll talk about this later after we've looked at all these passages, but this is key to understanding what's going on in Acts chapter 2, with them being filled with the Spirit and speaking in these other languages, because they are in Jerusalem, and it's clear, for example, somewhat clear in Genesis 11, very clear in Deuteronomy 28, that when they hear these other languages, it's a sign of God's judgment. And that's exactly what they should have learned in Acts chapter 2 when they heard these other tongues. Okay, then on the flip side of the coin, there also are passages such as we will look at here in Isaiah 33, stating that the absence of foreign tongues in Israel is a sign of God's blessing. So just the flip side of the coin. So in Isaiah chapter 33, Dick, would you read verse 17?
Okay, Isaiah 33:17. Okay. Thine eyes shall see the king in his beauty. They shall behold the land that is very far off.
Okay, so this verse speaks of Israel being blessed in the kingdom. Thine eyes shall see the king in his beauty. And then again in Isaiah 33, would Dan or Laura read verse 19?
Isaiah 33:19. Thou shalt not see a fierce people, a people of deeper speech than thou canst perceive, of a stammering tongue that thou canst not understand.
So in this passage where it's talking about the blessings that Israel will receive in the kingdom, it says in verse 19, thou shalt not see a fierce people, a people of a deeper speech than thou canst perceive, of a stammering tongue that thou canst not understand. So again, this is a flip side of the coin. Deuteronomy 28 warned, if they disobey God, they will be cursed. And one of the curses is that they will hear other languages in their land. Here, it's Israel being blessed in their kingdom. And one of the blessings is that they won't hear other speech, other tongues in their land. Excuse me. And so then in, again, Isaiah 33, would Bonsinger Joyce read verse 20?
Look upon Zion, the city of our solemnities. Thine eyes shall see Jerusalem, quiet habitation, tabernacle that shall not be taken down. Not one of the stakes thereof shall ever be removed, neither shall any of the cords thereof be broken.
So again, in the midst of talking about their kingdom blessings, they will look upon Zion, and there the glorious Lord will be unto us a place of broad rivers and streams. And again, no foreign tongue will be heard in the city of our solemnities. And then turn to Jeremiah chapter 5. And so you will see as we look at these passages that the meaning of them hearing other tongues, other languages in their land is very clear from the Old Testament. So there should have been no doubt in their minds what the meaning was when they heard these other tongues in Acts chapter 2. So another Old Testament passage regarding this again is in Jeremiah chapter 5. But first of all, would Dan or Lisa read Jeremiah chapter 4 and verse 1?
All right, Jeremiah chapter 4, verse 1. If thou wilt return, O Israel, saith the Lord, return unto me, and if thou wilt pray away thine abominations out of my sight, then thou shalt not remove.
And so the context here is Jeremiah is pleading with Israel to return to the Lord. And then go over to chapter 5. Excuse me. Chapter 5, and Gabrielle, would you read the first 3 verses in chapter 5?
Jeremiah 5, 1 through 3. Run ye to and fro through the streets of Jerusalem, and see now, and know, and seek in the broad places thereof, if ye can find a man, if there be any that executeth judgment, that seeketh the truth, and I will pardon it. And though they say, the Lord liveth, surely they swear falsely. O Lord, are not thine eyes upon the truth? Thou hast stricken them, but they have not grieved. Thou hast consumed them, but they have refused to receive correction. They have made their faces harder than a rock. They have refused to return.
So again, the context is Jeremiah is pleading with Israel to return to the Lord. But then as we come to chapter 5, you couldn't find a man in Jerusalem who sought the truth. And it says they have refused to return. And so then again in Jeremiah chapter 5, would Tim or Jean read verse 15?
Okay, Jeremiah 5, verse 15. Lo, I will bring a nation upon you from afar, O house of Israel, saith the Lord. It is a mighty nation. It is an ancient nation, a nation whose language thou knowest not, neither understandest what they say.
Okay, and so this is similar to what we read in Deuteronomy 28. I will bring a nation upon you from far. And it says that it is a nation whose language thou knowest not, neither understandest what they say. So Jeremiah is warning them of the same thing that we saw in Deuteronomy 28, that they will hear languages that they don't understand. And then again in Jeremiah chapter 5, Dominic, would you read verses 16 and 17?
Their quiver is as an open sepulchre. They are almighty men, and they shall eat up thine harvest and thy bread, which thy sons and thy daughters should eat. They shall eat up thy flocks and thine herbs. They shall eat up thy vines and thy fig trees. They shall impoverish thy fenced cities, wherein thou trustedst with the sword.
Okay, so as we read in Deuteronomy 28, Jeremiah warns them that they will hear a foreign language and that horrible judgments will come upon them. And so again, it's the meaning, the significance of the foreign language or foreign tongues in Deuteronomy 28, also here in Jeremiah chapter 5 is very clear. Then turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 14. And so it's clear and highly significant in these Old Testament passages that a prominent sign of judgment upon Israel was that they would hear foreign tongues. And so in 1 Corinthians chapter 14, Akun, would you read verse 21?
In the law it is written, with men of other tongues and other lips will I speak unto these people, and yet for all that will they not hear me, saith the Lord.
Okay, so of course chapters 12, 13, and 14 in 1 Corinthians are about spiritual gifts. And in chapter 14, he specifically is talking about the gift of prophecy and the gift of speaking with tongues. And so in the midst of that, he quotes in verse 21, he quotes another Old Testament passage, with men of other tongues and other lips will I speak unto this people. And so this, Paul here is quoting not from Deuteronomy 28, which he could have, not from Jeremiah 5, which he could have, but this is from Isaiah 28. So let's go back to Isaiah 28. And Paul is quoting from Isaiah chapter 28 and verses 11 and 12. So verse 11, for with stammering lips and another tongue will he speak to this people, to whom he said, this is the rest wherewith ye may cause the weary to rest, and this is the refreshing, yet they would not hear. So we'll take a more careful look at these verses in Isaiah and later, and also I want to look at the context in which these verses are found. And that'll help us better to understand what Paul is teaching in 1 Corinthians. The historical context of this passage in Isaiah 28 concerns the latter years of the reign of King Hezekiah in Judah, in the southern kingdom. And so instead of trusting the Lord to deliver them from Syria, Judah made an alliance with Egypt. And so that's one of the issues that Isaiah is dealing with here. And so in Isaiah 28, let's back up a little bit. Jean Gross, would you read verses 7 and 8 in Isaiah 28?
But they also have erred through wine, and through strong drink are out of the way. The priest and the prophet have erred through strong drink. They are swallowed up of wine. They are out of the way through strong drink. They err in vision. They stumble in judgment. For all tables are full of vomit and filthiness, so that there is no place clean.
Okay, so Isaiah warns here that the religious leaders in Judah will have these drunken parties. And again, as we've seen, Paul in 1 Corinthians 14, Paul quotes a couple of verses out of this chapter. And so it's interesting. Paul quotes verses regarding them speaking in tongues or speaking in other languages. But it's interesting that there are other connections between Isaiah 28 and 1 Corinthians. So again, here in verses 7 and 8, it warns about them having these drunken parties. We're going to come right back here to Isaiah, but turn for a moment to 1 Corinthians again, chapter 11. In 1 Corinthians chapter 11, Vicki, would you read verses 21 and 22?
For in eating everyone taketh before other his own supper, and one is hungry, and another is drunken. What, have you not houses to eat and to drink in? Or despise ye the church of God, and shame them that have not? What shall I say to you? Shall I praise you in this? I praise you not.
So I just find it kind of interesting in that Paul quotes from that chapter in Isaiah about speaking with tongues. But also there's this connection in Isaiah 28. It warns about the religious leaders having these drunken parties. And Paul has just spoken to the Corinthians about when they do the Lord's Supper, that some of them are getting drunk. Okay, then go back to Isaiah 28. And we will be going back to 1 Corinthians a bit later too. But Isaiah 28, and Dick, would you read verse 9? So Jean just read verses 7 and 8. Dick, would you read verse 9?
Okay. Isaiah 28, verse 9. Let me get down there. Whom shall he teach knowledge? And whom shall he make to understand doctrine? Them that are weaned from the milk and drawn from the breasts.
Okay, so in the context here, these drunken religious leaders that we read about verses 7 and 8, in verse 9, they're mocking Isaiah by asking, whom shall he teach knowledge? Whom is Isaiah going to teach knowledge? And the answer is them that are weaned from the milk. So they were scornful of Isaiah because they mocked him for teaching them as though they were little children. And then go back again to 1 Corinthians, and this time chapter 3. And 1 Corinthians chapter 3, and would Dan or Laura read the first two verses?
First Corinthians 3, 1 and 2. And brethren, I could not speak unto you as unto spiritual, but as unto carnal, even as unto babes in Christ. I have fed you with milk, and not with meat, for hitherto ye were not able to bear it, neither yet now are ye able.
So here's another connection between Isaiah 28 and 1 Corinthians. So in Isaiah 28, the religious leaders are mocking Isaiah because they believe he's teaching them as though they're little children. And here in 1 Corinthians, Paul says, and I, brethren, could not speak unto you as unto spiritual, but as unto carnal, even as unto babes in Christ. And Paul says that he had to feed them milk rather than feeding them meat doctrine. And then look in 1 Corinthians chapter 14. 1 Corinthians chapter 14. And would Bonsinger Joyce read verse 20?
Brethren, be not children in understanding, howbeit in malice be ye children, but in understanding be men.
Okay, and so the verse that in verse 21 again is where Paul quotes from Isaiah 28. But in the previous verse, in verse 20, he tells the Corinthians not to be children in understanding, which again is what the religious leaders in Isaiah 28 were mocking Isaiah for, teaching them as though they're children in understanding. Okay, then again, back to Isaiah 28. And in Isaiah 28, Gabrielle, would you read verse 10?
Isaiah 28:10. For precept must be upon precept, precept upon precept, line upon line, line upon line, here a little and there a little.
Okay, this verse I have most often heard quoted or referred to as being a good verse about how to go about teaching. And there's some truth to that because it is usually better to teach in a step-by-step systematic fashion. And so verse 10 says precept upon precept, line upon line, here a little, there a little. So I can see why people would often use the verse for that point. But this verse, as we've seen, is in the context of God rebuking Israel for being such babes that they can't be taught as adults. They're like the Corinthians. They have to be taught like they're little children, like they're babes. And so actually the point in verse 10 is that adults should not have to be taught in the way verse 10 describes. Precept upon precept, line upon line, here a little, there a little. That's how little children have to be taught, but adults should not need to be taught that way. So this is again the drunken religious leaders thinking that Isaiah's doctrine is too simple and childish for them. And then a moment ago I read verses 11 and 12, which is what Paul quotes in 1 Corinthians. So I'm going to skip over verses 11 and 12 for the moment and get the context a bit more here. So in Isaiah 28 again, would Tim or Jean read verse 13?
Okay, Isaiah 28, verse 13. But the word of the Lord was upon them, precept upon precept, precept upon precept, line upon line, line upon line, here a little and there a little, that they might go and fall backward and be broken and snared and taken.
Okay, so verse 13 repeats that teaching method that was mentioned in verse 10. And it says that they were taught in this way in verse 13, that they might go and fall backward and be broken and snared and taken. So the context here is not, this is a good way to go about teaching. This, in teaching this way, it's a rebuke to them because they're so childish. And the result of them being taught in that way is they go backward and are broken. And then again in Isaiah 28, Dominic, would you read verse 14?
Verse 14, wherefore hear the word of the Lord, ye scornful men that rule this people which is in Jerusalem.
Okay, so at the end of verse 13, it says they will be snared and taken. And that's referring to the fact they're going to be taken captive by Assyria. And then verse 14 makes it clear that this passage is primarily aimed at ye scornful men that rule this people which is in Jerusalem. The same ones that were getting drunk in verses 7 and 8. So it's important to keep in mind here that, of course, God taught Israel in her mother tongue, in Hebrew. And now that we've seen the context, again, it's verses 11 and 12 that Paul quotes in 1 Corinthians. And so verse 11 says, for with stammering lips and another tongue will he speak to this people. So God is warning Israel that he's going to speak to them in another tongue, in a foreign language, as we saw in Deuteronomy 28 and Jeremiah 5. And specifically in this case, he's going to speak to them in the Assyrian language because they refused to listen to God when he spoke to them in their own tongue, in Hebrew. So now he's going to speak to them in another tongue that they don't understand, in Assyrian. So why did God speak to Israel in a foreign language? Were they expected to learn from a language that they couldn't understand? And so we actually, I'm going to stop here for today, and we'll pick this up next time and look a little bit more specifically at verses 11 and 12 here. But it seems very clear as you look at these passages in Genesis 11, Deuteronomy 28, Jeremiah 5, and now the one Paul quotes here in Isaiah 28, the significance of Israel being spoken to in another language is very clear. It's clearly a sign of God's judgment upon them, a warning of judgment. And that's what is going on in Acts chapter 2, when they hear them speak in all these different languages. They should have clearly known from these Old Testament passages that that's the meaning of them hearing these other tongues spoken. So again, I will stop there for today, and again, we'll pick this up a little bit more and conclude it next time. All right, thank you all.
Thanks, Dan.
Thank you, Dan.